Well, let's talk about, so you guys have experienced suicide on a personal level, and can you guys tell us about your story?
Do you want me to start?
Yes.
Okay. We lost our son to suicide December 8th, 2014. And for our experience, it was really a shock. Ben really did not, our son that died by suicide is Benjamin. Ben really didn't portray the normal, what we might think of as normal signs for somebody who would do something like that. When Ben was in high school, I got a phone call from the principal there, and he said, "Keith, you need to come to my office because Ben is in my office and he's talking about experiencing dark places." And that was really the only hint that we ever had. We got him counseling. After that, he went through 6-8 counseling sessions, and he did well with that. We thought he had things kind of under control. He went to basic training after he graduated from high school. And if anywhere you're going to break, you would think that's where it would be. But he knew who the chaplains were. He knew where he needed to go if he was experiencing some issues. He went to Afghanistan with our guard unit as a support. That's a bridging unit. And so they're mostly just support. And he was mostly bored in Afghanistan. He would have liked to have gone out more because that's just kind of the person he is. Because he was there to help the civilians. He was there to help the people, and he would have liked to have gone out more. And so we thought things were going well, and just really didn't think about it. He never, like I said, even his friends, his professors, people who knew him, would never have guessed that he would do something like this.
And when he was in high school with a counselor, her comment to us was that he just needed some extra help with coping mechanisms. And that was the thing, is that when he was given some extra help with that, then things seemed to be, fall into place. And because we even questioned her, is he ready to go to basic training, and she was like, oh yes, there shouldn't be any problems, this kind of thing. So it was all pretty much a sense that life was back to normal and that he was handling things. So it was a surprise.
So he had been home the weekend before his death for a Guard Christmas party, National Guard Christmas party. We didn't see him much that weekend. Of course, we've got our things, and he was mostly with the guards. And on his way back to Sioux Falls, he was going to Augustana College at that time. He had a semester left. He was finishing up that semester, and he had one more semester left. He was looking at, a couple weeks earlier, Ben and I had gone deer hunting, and we had a good experience. A lot of time to talk together, and he was talking about going to seminary, and so things, like I said, just looked really good. And on his way back to Sioux Falls after that weekend, he called Deb, and he said, "Just want you to know that my girlfriend and I aren't living together right now." And I told her, I need some time to clear my head. I need some space to clear my head. Well, 20/20 hindsight, you go, oh, maybe that should have been a red flag. But, heavens, when you're that age, you got a girlfriend, you're looking at graduation, it make perfect sense. And so Deb, when she got off the phone, told me, she said, maybe you want to call Ben. And I'm thinking as a young male, the last person I want to talk to about girl problems is my dad. So I texted him. I said, are you home? And you're all right? He's like, yeah, just going through some old films.
And we knew he had talked to us, and he was a theater and religion major, and so one of his religion classes was actually putting on a production of a gospel message. And so that was, they're into finals week at Augustana, and so this was their final project. And so they had been meeting to get things ready for that and to rehearse for that.
So that was Sunday night. So the phone call came 5 o'clock Monday morning. And as a pastor, it's not totally uncommon to get phone calls in the middle of the night, but I don't get a lot of them. And the voice on the other end was Ben's Army sergeant, guard sergeant. He says, "Keith, are you home?" I go, "Yeah." He says, "We're outside your door. I need to talk to you." And it's at that point that your heart sinks. And of course, I'm still going, oh, maybe it's not Ben. Maybe it's someone else in the guard unit that they want help with. And I looked out the window of the door and I saw his sergeant and a police officer. And I've heard enough stories that went, this is not a visit a parent wants to hear. And I opened the door and I said, this doesn't look good. I think I need to get Deb. And Danny Heil was his sergeant. He said, yes, you need to get Deb. And then we heard it was suicide. And it's amazing how the mind works, because when I heard that, the first thought that I had was back to that phone call when he was in high school, and the principal saying, Ben's experiencing dark places. And at that point is when I really made the connection between mental illness and suicide. And so some things happened that week, a couple of things. One of the things that happened between his death and the funeral was people were trying to blame other things. People were trying to blame his experience in Afghanistan for his suicide, PTSD. And it's like, no, he was bored. He had a positive experience in Afghanistan. It wasn't that. Other people were trying to blame the breakup with his girlfriend. And it's like, no, that was his choice. It's not that. And so that plus a combination, we received I will put sympathy card from someone who said, I'll paraphrase it basically, in spite of Ben's actions, I will struggle to be proud of him. And it was at that point I thought, I am not going to be ashamed of my son, and I'm not going to be ashamed of the way he died. And we're going to talk about this. We're going to get this out there right now, and I'm not going to hide it. And
when you live in a smaller community, and you live in an area where everyone knows you, and this is a child who's grown up in the church since he's been in 3rd grade. So everyone is very aware of who he is and what is going on, and it's just like, no, you don't really understand, and we need to help you understand. And so we want to be honest with people.
And I spoke at his funeral. I didn't do the funeral, but I spoke at his funeral, and I put it right out there, and I said, we're going to talk about the S word. We're going to talk about suicide. And we're going to just put it out there, because Ben did not fit what we typically think of as someone who would die by suicide. Ben had his whole future ahead of him. He wasn't hopeless. He didn't come from a broken family. There wasn't alcoholism. there was nothing you could really point to, especially where we live. A lot of it is when you hear suicide, it's like, oh, it's because of the hopelessness that they faced or whatever. And it's like, no, it's more than that. There's a mental illness going on there. Yeah, there's a hopelessness, but most of that is because that mental illness takes you to that place of hopelessness.
And it was even things as far as Ben had to have a senior project, so he had talked to us about having gone to the Western Studies Center, and he was going to be looking at the role of the church in missions and that kind of thing on the reservations. And so we're like, that was what made it so difficult, is we're going, you talk to us about all these things in the future and future plans. And so the idea that you could stop when you were making all these plans was so difficult to come to grips with. And, we always think, well, if there's a suicide, there's a note. Well, there was no note. And so we really struggled with this why and how and so it was difficult because you wanted to go, what could we have done? What did we miss, kind of thing. Yeah. And then you came back to the fact that there wasn't a good answer, and that as the type of person that he was and with the skills that he had, he did a really good job of hiding. And he not only hid it from us, he hid it from his professors, he hid it from people that work with a lot of different people and who typically would recognize signs of mental illness and signs of depression. And they're all like, we just saw him and we don't understand this.
The other thing with Ben was this act of suicide did not match Ben. I mean, Ben loved life, and that sounds odd talking about someone who would take their life, but Ben really loved life, and Ben loved people. He had a great compassion for people. And looking back on it, I think a lot of it is because of that mental illness. He knew what it was like to deal with that darkness and that uncertainty. And so, that was part of the thing. Everybody else in our community, in our church, his friends were all dealing with how could this guy who loves life and was just so vibrant take his life. And again, that's part of the reason we do this, is not that our family is special, any more special than any family, but if it can happen in my family, our family, it can happen in any family, and it does happen in any family. So, and then part of the reason too is that we do this is, with suicide, there can be such a feeling of isolation for the family. And we want other people to know they're not alone,
And it's not even just the family. It's people who are dealing with depression and anxiety and mental illnesses tend to feel that they are alone, that nobody else understands their story, nobody else is experiencing what they're experiencing. And the thing that we see with that too is the fact that, we never hear about success stories. So people don't come up and say, oh yes, I've been to a counselor, I was depressed, and I'm now so much better. You don't hear that from people. But if you were sick and you had had cancer and you'd gone for treatment and you were now in remission, everyone would be celebrating with you. But that's not the way that it works when we start to talk about suicide and mental illness.
And even when you're sick, if somebody's got cancer, there's all kinds of support groups. There's people that gather around you. They bring you, potluck, or they bring you casseroles. And mental illness has such a stigma that goes with it. People think we can control this thing, the brain, and you can't. I mean, you can to an extent, you know, there's some things with positive thinking and something like that. But when you're dealing with a mental illness, there is no control to it. But yet, you know, we think of people with mental illness, oh, they're weak. They're weak mentally. You know, that's kind of the, just think your way out of it. Oh, you're depressed. Well, just think happy thoughts. Hakuna Matata. You know, it's like, no, it doesn't work that way. And so.
And I think that's what I talk to my students in school, and it's kind of like, if I can help someone to not have to experience what I've experienced, then it's worth whatever we do, because it isn't something you want someone else to experience. And so if we would allow students to just acknowledge, or people to just acknowledge that, yes, I don't feel well, I'm mentally depressed at this point, I'm thinking about suicide. If we weren't afraid to talk about it, we would have people who would be able to go on and live whole lives.
The other challenge, I think, with mental illness is where's that line? Where's that line where it's a real serious mental illness, or where is it just, I'm having a bad day, I'm depressed today, I'm in a funk. You know, there's a lot of times I'm sad, even more so now. You know, but I don't consider suicide. So where is that line? You know, and I think that's the hard part with mental illness. Where's that line where it's just somebody going through a funk or a bad stage, or that really serious mental illness?
Why do you feel it is important to talk about this sensitive subject?
Mainly for the stigma. To try, a couple of reasons. One is to try to ease the stigma that comes with mental illness and suicide. For people who have lost, family members who have lost members to suicide, there is this sense of being alone. Suicide, death by suicide comes with its challenges for the family, because there's this really, nobody understands it. And it has its own challenges as far as how you deal with it, and people don't want to talk to you.
It's the elephant in the room. We all know that it's there, but nobody wants to be the person to really reach up and touch it and say, okay, is this real? Did this happen? You know, and people are afraid that it's like, well, if I bring it up, are people going to break down? Or if I talk about this person, you know, how are they going to react? And for us, it was like, if people would ask us about Ben, we were more than willing to talk about Ben, because we want to know that people remember him, and we want the good things. So we want him to be remembered by the way he lived his life, not for the final seconds of his life. And that's a huge thing, is that it's not the way that he died, it's the way that he lived that is important.
So to kind of ease the stigma is one reason, and then bring awareness and education. After Ben's death, we started a walk in the spring of the year, and we don't do it to raise money, really. You know, if people want to donate, we give it to the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, but that's not our main purpose. Our main purpose is just to raise awareness, education, and show support of people who are dealing with mental illness, and families who are, and even families who are living with someone with a mental illness.
And it's things that I think about as far as visiting with a grandparent who's saying, how do I know my granddaughter's getting to an age where she's going to want to ask about her father and how he died, and how do I talk to her about his death? You know, and that whole thing, and it's difficult because in a school system we have a specific way that we deal with a death by an accident and a death by a suicide. And so if we have a student who dies in a car accident, students we may close school down, kids may make t-shirts, they may do different kinds of things.
Decorate the locker.
Decorate the locker. But if we have a student who dies with a death by suicide, the school keeps it very, very low key. It's really not discussed. You cannot open your school facilities during a school day for a funeral usually. They discourage students from doing some of those normal mourning things because they're afraid that we're glorifying suicide and that there will be other students who will copy that and that you would have copycat suicides. But
there's a real fear in that.
But at the same point that I'm sitting here thinking, but if that were my child and that died, I would be upset that they have someone who dies during the school year, and at their graduation they leave them an empty seat. But if it comes to a suicide, we're not going to do that. You can't do that. The death is the same to the family. It's still our child. No matter how they died, it's still our child, and we're still standing there going, they should have been here. They should be here at this time. And so it's difficult to balance those things that the guidelines for how to deal with suicide with the death when you are the immediate person impacted.
Well, and even the students, like Deb had mentioned earlier, they're not allowed to mourn, because that is part of the ritual, that is part of the mourning process, and you're denying them that. But it is. It's all because of fear by administration and good, bad, or indifferent. It's because of the fear of the copycat. That the students will say, look at how everybody loved them and all the great things they say about that person. I want that for me, and so I'm going to take my life. And we have to really applaud Augustana University because Augustana invited us to a memorial service. So after Ben's death, we were on campus at Augustana in the chapel, and we're able to sit through a service with students who shared the things that they remembered about Ben and shared the music that he loved and shared that whole worship experience that he valued. So some of these things some of these policies depend on what age group you're working with. But that was really a good experience for us, and it was helpful for us to hear those stories that we usually didn't hear.
What have you done to handle the grief? And you've said you've done, you wrote your book, maybe touch on that a little bit, but.
I spoke at Ben's funeral, again, because I wanted to get it out there. I wanted people to, know that we're open to talking about this and we're not going to hide this. And I had a lot of people that were there that went, wow, you need to put that out there. So I put it on our church's website, and I started a little blog then. As things would come up, I would write about the grief process or questions that I had that were rattling around in my brain. And over about 2 years mostly is what I wrote. And so I put them in a book. And then I had people who were saying, you need to put this in a book, and then you need to get it out there for other people, other parents, other family members, and just kind of to help raise awareness. So that's one of the things I've done. We started the walk.
Miss You Walk.
We call it the Miss You Walk. We didn't realize that American Foundation for Suicide Prevention has an Out of the Darkness walk. So we wanted a walk, and I wanted to call it something besides, a Ben Kraft memorial. This is for everybody who's experienced this. And so I didn't want it Ben. And so we came up with MISYA, which is MISYA, Mental Illness Suicide Yearly Awareness Walk. And it works. We miss you. And even people who are dealing with mental illness at the time really aren't themselves. And so even when they're going through that, the family's going, we really miss you the way you were. So we started that. And we also started a suicide mental illness support group. And we meet on the fourth Monday.
Fourth Sunday.
Our fourth Sunday of each month. And there's only about 5 or 6 of us that meet. There could be more, but, and it's, what's odd about that, I'll let you go. What's odd about that is I'm not a support group person, but it has been really, really helpful, and partly because it's just a small group, so.
And I said the hard part is that you really don't have to look very hard to find people who've been impacted by suicide and mental illness. But our group has had people in different stages. So we had a family who had a family member who died about
5 or 6
5 years before Ben's death. And then our family, and then we had another family that was
just a week after
after Ben's death. And so, you know, the family that had been through this longer was able to say, it's okay, you're gonna get through this. Yes, yep. This is how we coped with this, and maybe you wanna think about that. And one, for us it was the loss of a child, for another person it was the loss of a husband. And so even looking at how different people treated things with, depending on what individual in our families it was, made a difference.
The thing I've learned through this experience is death, the grief process is individual and relational. Everybody goes through it differently. And it all depends, well, it depends on you as an individual, but it also depends on the relationship you had with that person. We had a great relationship with our son. If our relationship would have been strained, our grieving process would have been different. I mean, it still would have been there, and the pain would have been there, but it would have been in a different way. And so that's one of the things I've learned is you know, it's, you know, they talk about the different stages of going through grief. One of the things I've never felt is anger. I've never been angry with Ben, and I've never really been angry with the way he died, because to me, suicide is what took my son's life, our son's life. But mental illness, he died from mental illness. It wasn't suicide. Suicide was, it's like people with cancer, they may, when they pass away, they may write on their, you know, heart attack or whatever.
Congestive heart failure.
Congestive heart failure, but it's really the cancer that killed them. And that's the way I look at with Ben. It's a mental illness that took his life. The way he died was by suicide. So that's why I don't, you know, the anger hasn't been, and the guilt hasn't been there for me. Because it's like, yeah, maybe we could have, you know, maybe there was something we missed, but I never really felt that.
Yeah. And when you ask about how do we deal with it, for me, being at school, when I'm at school, I have to totally be at school. And part of my job is not bringing, you know, I want to work with my students and do the best job that I can. And so I have to kind of set aside some of my personal things when I come to school. But at the same point, I am more aware of students who I see dealing with things, and I've tried to be an advocate for those students. And one of the things that I see is I've had certain students who've kind of come and talked to me because they have experienced suicide within their family. And then I've had other students who, you know, maybe they don't come and talk to me, but then in discussion with staff about, oh, why isn't someone getting this done or this done, I have to then stand back and say to staff members, you realize that all of these things are going on in their life, that they cannot be solely focused on school at this point, because look at what else is happening. And so can we be more compassionate perhaps in the way that we deal with this student, because you're going to have to make some accommodations. They're doing the best that they can. And within the last, it's been almost 5 years now. So last year, one of the things that I realized is that immediately after Ben's death, students knew, because it's a small community, okay, this is what happened with Mrs. Kraft. But they didn't so much anymore. And so then one of the things that Keith had done, so what I went ahead and did was, I have my tattoo, all right? And so my tattoo has the semicolon saying that I am willing to talk about suicide and to do that. And so it was really interesting, because that was in November, and of course I'm wearing long sleeves most of the time, and I am talking about something in class, and I go like this, and I have a top that has sleeves that are kind of belled, and they slid back, and all of a sudden there's my tattoo, and the whole class is looking at me. They're like, it was just dead silence, because it was like, Mrs. Kraft has a tattoo? Kind of like, when did this happen? And did we really see this? And so then that has become a way for me to talk to students. So when they see the semicolon there, they know, okay, she's willing to talk to us about this. And I don't have to have a big sign that says, Mrs. Kraft's son died by suicide, or anything like that. And so it's a language then that are a cue to students to say, okay, I would talk to them. And so that's been kind of my message.
The other thing for coping is we're willing to talk about it. Yeah. So we have talked to a couple of schools, school assemblies. Mm-hmm. I've done a couple of book talks, taking that out. The other thing for me personally is my faith, obviously as a pastor, but I really have to lean on that and trust. She showed her tattoo. I have a tattoo that has Genesis 1, and 2, and it's a reminder to me that even not only in my darkness and my chaotic life since Ben's death, that God is present, but also God was present in Ben's darkest, most chaotic day of his time of his life. And a lot of times people might think, oh, somebody died by suicide, God abandoned them or something like that. And it's like, no, that was probably when God was closest. And I have to, for me personally, it might not be for everybody, but for me, that's where I have to come down. My hope and my faith is what I have to lean on. And so...
And we do a good job of leaning on each other.
Yes, we do.
So we, the statistical odds are that when there's a death of a child, that typically there's strain on the relationship, and it's not uncommon to have a divorce. And so, for us, it was kind of like this, we do not want this to happen to us. And so we want to keep talking to each other. We want to keep leaning on each other so that the relationship is stronger rather than weaker because of the pressure.
And it hasn't always been easy.
Yeah, it's not always easy.
And realistically, it's like, okay, I understand why there's divorce in these situations, because I might be here and she's over here, and we're not in the same place. And it's like, I'm trying to deal with my grief. I can't handle your grief right now. Yeah. Or if I'm in this place that I'm okay and you're not, I don't want, it's like, okay, so, but yeah, we've managed so far.
And the other thing as far as dealing with this grief process is you'll be going along thinking, okay, everything's going fine, and then there'll be one little trigger, something that reminds you of your loved one or something that happens. One of the first years after Ben's death, they had a Veterans Day program. And I'm sitting in the Veterans Day program watching this and seeing the flag and different things that are happening. And I'm having this flashback to the flag being taken off of the casket and being handed to us. And it's kind of like, okay, I just can't handle this. I have to get up and leave, because I really don't want to be standing in an assembly crying in front of my students. And so I just left. And the next year then, when we got ready for this, I just said to the principal, I said, I just want you to be aware that I may get up and leave. It's okay, but just know that this could be something that I have difficulty with. And so don't be concerned if this happens. And the school's been really good about dealing with those kinds of things with me. But there are triggers, that little things, and, for us, when the date of Ben's death, when we talked to our daughter, she told us that she was expecting her first child.
On that day.
On that day. So we really had this thing of, you have a death, and you have the promise of new life, and you have that continuum. And we have 4 grandchildren, and 3 of them have been born since Ben's death. But Ben's name was Benjamin Charles, and we have a granddaughter whose name is Charlotte, and we have a grandson whose name is Bennett. And so they represent that promise, and they represent also the fact that his siblings still remember Ben. They still can have that relationship even with the death.
Family has become really important. I mean, it always was, but you really do treasure the time. I know, and it's harder to leave our kids. We go to visit, it's harder to leave them. Just because there's a lot of things that are different now. I'm more emotional. Emotions are more on the edge. Stupid things. Shows that you've seen 100 times, but they might be a little bit of a sadness to it. I can feel it more. It's just so, it's odd. And the thing is too, this has been 5 years, and you can tell how close this is yet. Yeah. And a lot of people are like, oh, it's been 5 years. They should be beyond it. It's like, no, not, especially not when it's a child. It's not right. It's not right. So do I get to show my tattoo?
Yeah, please do. Yeah, please do.
There's mine. So it says Genesis 1, 1, and 2.
And the semicolon.
And with the semicolon, yeah. Our son, shortly after Ben's death, said he got a tattoo, and he got a semicolon, and I don't know, it's some type of a game character,
because it was something they did together.
Something they did together, and okay, a tattoo was something I would never do. I grew up in a straight-laced family, man. You do not put things on your body that's permanent, and I just wouldn't do that. And it's like, but I wanted something that I could carry for the rest of my life. And when we talk to like when we talk to students, I'd say, I carry 2 scars. One you can see, and that's the tattoo, because I would not have that if it wouldn't have been for Ben. And the other one you can't see, and that's in here. And I'll carry those both for the rest of my life. They're both permanent scars that'll never heal completely.
So what would you guys say to someone who maybe is considering taking their own life?
I hate to say that it's temporary, because at that point, the ideation of suicide is so strong and so heavy, and the heaviness in that sense that they might be better off, their families might be better off without them. I would say you need to understand that is the mental illness speaking to you. That is that ideation speaking to you, because that's not true. You know, if you think about the things that we've been talking about and our responses, you know that there's no way we would consider our lives now better without Ben than the life we could imagine with Ben, because there's so many things that we look at and say, you know, it's like going to a wedding this past weekend with a nephew, thinking, we're never going to see that. We're never going to see that wedding. We're never going to see those grandchildren that he might have had. We're not going to see that college graduation. We're not going to hear that joke that he would have told us, or that snarky t-shirt that he would have worn. Those are all things that we miss in his absence. And there are always people in your life that have things about you that they would miss. I made the comment to students this past week that, you know, there's always that auntie or that grandma who's there silently maybe pushing you on or trying to support you. In some way, there's someone in your life who cares and will miss you deeply. And so please think about them.
People who die by suicide don't really want to die. I mean, again, that may sound weird, but they don't really want to die. But their mind is telling them that their loved ones would be better off without them. And it's a lie.
Or the pain is so deep that they can't handle that load of that pain.
So I would say, I mean, seek someone out. Seek someone you trust. Seek someone that you can talk to. I mean, they're just, it's like, they sound like really easy suggestions, but again, when they're in that state, they're not thinking rationally. The key to it is for people who are, to me, who are dealing with depression and anxiety. I'm definitely not a doctor. I'm not a psychiatrist. But to me, it's kind of like it goes up and down. And it's kind of, they need to know their triggers. And they need to get it before it gets down there. It's kind of like if you could figure out where that is, where you're going to start going down, that's when you need to do something about it. To me, suicide is a combination of two things. With my experience, again, I'm not a psychiatrist or a doctor or anything, but to me, suicide is a combination of two things: a mental illness and a stressor. And the stressors can be just common everyday stressors. For Ben, it was, I've got a girlfriend, how does she fit in? I'm going to graduate, what do I do with the rest of my life? This is something every college student goes through. But when you combine that with a depression and an anxiety, and it's at a bad place, the two combinations are lethal. And so to me, the key is, how do you do it? How do you find that before you get to that, I'm thinking about taking my life?
If someone wants to know more about maybe prevention and maybe this topic in general, where would you suggest that maybe they could go, if you guys know of anything, or seek, you know?
Well, I know, you know, that in South Dakota it's difficult because we don't always have good access to mental health professionals. So certainly trying to find a counselor that you can talk to and that you feel supported by that you connect with would be really important. For us, one of the things that we've used as a resource is the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And so I know that both the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the National Alliance for Mental Illness, that both of those organizations have really good materials, they have really good sources. And remember that crisis helplines are there, and those are both text and phone. And so even for people who don't feel comfortable using a phone or don't want to call on a phone, there are numbers that they can text and they can do responses. And people who are there are trained, and they will take the time to visit with you and to help people in times of need.
What was his age?
He was 24 years old. He had turned you know how the Johnny Cash says, I turned 21 in prison? He turned 21 in Afghanistan. So that was always the family joke. You turned 21 in Afghanistan. Oh boy, you know, that's so much fun. But his birthday is actually the 28th of November, and his death was December 8th. So it was just shortly after that. And we actually have a friend, we had talked about how he will forever be 24. We will never have that chance to see a 30-year-old Ben or a 50-year-old Ben. And we have a friend who sings, and so he actually put together a song for us that talks about being forever 24.
I wrote a poem.
Yeah.
I wrote a poem called Forever 24. And then he says, well, you know, it kind of has that rhythm. I could probably put music to it. And so he just put a little music to it. So it's,
To your mother and me, you will always be 10 days plus year 24. That was your age when you last turned the page. Not one day or 1 year more. Ever 24, you will never grow old. We will never have the chance to see your life unfold. Ever 24, you will never grow old, but we will always love you.
and that's the other thing with the book. It's blogs, and I have some poems in there. I never consider myself a poet, but when things rattle around in the brain so long, they got to come out somehow, so I write them down. So, you know, one of the questions I think was asked too is, what about, you know, a friend? What do you do if you're a friend? And I think getting back to your other question too, as far as if you're dealing with mental illness, it's okay for you to find other friends who have, you know, that struggle with mental illness, depression, anxiety, whatever it is. But you also need to have a stable friend. You need somebody stable in your life so that when you get to that point,
To that breaking point.
to that point of you're thinking about taking your life, you have somebody to go talk to. And what I would say with a friend, especially when we talk to high school kids, we tell them that if a friend comes up to you and says, I want to tell you something, but I don't want you to tell anybody else. And you say, okay. And they say, you know, I'm thinking about taking my life. Break that promise. You cannot keep that promise. You need, as a teenager or younger, you need to tell a trusted adult, because you do not want to be, if you're that friend, you do not want to be the only person that knows
that secret.
that secret.
Yeah. Yeah.
We did not know that Ben attempted suicide 2 other times, or talked suicide, didn't attempt it, but threatened suicide 2 other times. We did not know that. Only one person knew that.
And we think about that we think, well, if we had known that, would we have been able to, would we have done things differently? Would we have pushed more on things? You know, so it's important not to hide those kinds of things. And it's important as a friend, you know, to support them and to help them. And that help means getting professional help. You know, when we work with students, we make the comment that if you had a broken arm, if you came to me and said, I have a broken arm, I wouldn't say, well, I'll just jerk it back into place and then you'll be just fine and we're just going to go on as if nothing
Don't tell anybody.
Yeah, you know, as nothing ever happened. But that's what we do with mental illness and with suicide attempts. Is it's like this becomes this big secret we have, and so no one else can know this. And we lose students with that, and that's important.
What are you two asked most often about Ben's story, or maybe the topic, you know, of suicide in general?
People kind of want to know the why, you know, and all we can do is say we don't know why, and we have to come to grips, if you will, and that was probably one of the biggest things with grief, was realizing we would never know why. We would never understand why. There weren't easy answers to that one.
The name of my book is Pain Seeking Understanding. I tell people, spoiler alert, there's no understanding. You know, how do you understand something that you can't understand? And I think, like when we talked to the youth last week, one of the questions was, how are you dealing with your grief? You know, how did you deal with it? And again, it's just, the pain is always there. You learn to live with it and you go on because you have to. Mm-hmm. You have no other option. You just go on.
And you know that just because that person is gone, just because Ben was gone, doesn't mean he would want us to quit living our lives. You know, that as much as he embraced and loved life, it's important that we find those spots of joy and that we find those little things that help us to continue to put one foot in front of another. And some days that's pretty easy to do, and some days you wake up and it's dark and gray and you just want to kind of crawl up and stay in bed and say, do I have to do anything today? But you know that, you know, we know that our grandchildren need us. We know that our children need us. We know we want to see their futures. And so that propels you forward because there's still life that's going on. And sometimes that's the hardest thing when you're first experiencing that death, is because your whole world has crashed. Everything has turned upside down. And yet within 3 days after a funeral, everybody else is back at their regular job. Everybody else is going on with their life. And you're sitting there going, but you don't understand. My life has changed totally. And it's so hard because you know that it's always going to be different, but everybody else keeps going.
I've come to grips that I'll always be a broken person. You know, our life will, and I'm okay with that. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think that's the key for me to keep going on, is to realize this is my life. I'm not going to be the life of the party. You know, the sadness is going to be there a lot more than it would have been if this wouldn't happen. I will go into a funk more often. But you know what? I'm okay with that. And if other people aren't, I'm okay with it.
And that's it. You have a new reality. And it is what it is.
I think for me too, one of the things is I worry about my grandchildren. I worry about our grandchildren a lot because they, you know, there is some thought that it might be hereditary. And I, you know, and so I look in our grandchildren to see if there's some of the same behaviors that Ben had at that age. Mm-hmm. The other thing, when she was talking about triggers, one of mine is little boys crying. Because I did not lose just a 24-year-old. I also lost this little innocent boy that we raised, and the little boy with the little Barney hat that got lost at the state fair. And we were looking all over for him. And he was just perfectly happy playing in the dust with one of my brushes for the pigs, you know. That's what you lose. When you lose a child, you don't lose an adult 24-year-old. You lose the infant, the toddler, all the way through life. You've lost that. And I think for me, it's that innocence that you lose. And so for me, real trigger, I had a niece of hers that her little boy was 2 years old, was crying. I got up and I walked out. And she kind of looked at me and I told her why afterwards, and she went, "Oh, okay, now I understand."
So maybe a bottom line for our audience about the message you guys are portraying for us, if you have one. You can think for a little bit if you need to.
You're not alone. To me, that's the biggest thing. That's why I wrote the book. That's why we speak. That's why we have the support group. And mainly ours, mine is to surround the families. Mostly because I'm not qualified to deal with the mental illness. I'll support you all I can, but I can't help you. I can take you. If you come to me with a mental illness and say, "I don't know what I'm doing," I will say, I will go with you to a doctor. I will be there with you, but I can't be the one. But mainly for me is just that people who have lost loved ones and people who are dealing with mental illness, you're not alone.
And that whole idea that you're not alone is huge. And that idea that to recognize that there is hope, that with treatment and with support, that individuals can get better. I think that one is huge. I think one of the things that I missed when we talked about what would you say to a friend or to someone, kids need to understand, okay, so I may say, I'm depressed and that kind of thing. But if you ask someone, do you have a plan? And they tell you yes, you need to grab that person and you need to take them to someone who can help them. Because when someone starts to say, yes, I have a plan, that's a sign that things are very, very dangerous. And so, but asking that question, do you have a plan, never plants an idea. So it doesn't give me the idea that I'm going to die by suicide. It simply is an acknowledgement of this is one of the questions and one of the things that happens. And if you tell me yes, I need to help you. And that one's huge.
And that's a difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
Nobody really wants to say, do you ask
do you have a plan?
That question.
Yeah.
So.
It's an older audience and maybe grandparents who think, wow, what if my grandson or granddaughter we're doing this way and we don't know about it? What do they do? What can you tell them? Do you ask your kids, your grandkids, have you thought about suicide?
Yes. Okay. Yes, ask that question.
Yeah.
And we're, especially in the Midwest, I think we're all taught to be so polite that, we don't want to ask that question. But part of the reason we don't ask that question is because we're afraid. We're afraid of the answer. And I think about that, should I have asked some of those questions? And I think so I do think, it is good to say, are you okay? It is good to say, do you have a plan? Ask, is there someone you can see? Is there someone you trust? I think those are important things to ask.
I think too, as far as family members, especially like grandparents, is aunts, uncles, pay attention to their moods, their habits. If there's a change, if there's a real change in what they're doing, if they're really happy and now they're sad, or
They're
even
sad,
even
and then-
worse if they've been kind of in this depressed mood, and then all of a sudden they're really happy. Sometimes that's a sign they've made a decision to take their life. And so, you know, it's kind of like pay attention, become more aware of your loved ones' moods and habits and characteristics or whatever.
And it's difficult when you live a distance because you don't always see those things. You know, one of the things that we realized afterwards, you know, was, okay, so it's getting to the end of the semester, things are really busy. Ben typically swam in the morning as part of his exercise because he had bad ankles from Afghanistan, so he had to swim to exercise. So he had missed his exercise. He typically played handball with a number of people, older adults at Augustana. He hadn't made handball dates. And then when you figure that the fact that he was back for a Christmas party in a guard unit, well, you can guess there's probably going to be alcohol there. So now we've added a depressant upon another depression. And so those are all things that made that situation worse.
The swimming and the handball, the biking, those were ways that Ben used to deal with some of his stress relief.
Yeah.
And then when he quit doing that, it just kind of all built up. But when we're not there, we don't, you know, you don't think about that.
Yeah.
You don't see it.
Yeah. And then that was one of the things his girlfriend told us afterwards too, was he had started seeing a counselor, but then again, as things got busy, he quit making appointments. And so instead of really realizing how important those were to his health and his physical and mental health, you know, you just figured you could power through it.
The other thing I would say to, especially the grandparents and parents, older adults, don't deny it. I think one of the worst things we can do is be in denial of the mental illness. Oh, that can't happen to my son, my daughter. You know, just power through it. You know, we don't understand. It's like we need to accept what they're going through and support them through that. And again, like I was saying for me, be there for them. Take them to a, you know, you're dealing with this. You know what? I'll go with you. I will take you and sit with you and hold your hand while you're waiting to go in, whatever it takes. But mainly is just don't
minimize it.
Don't minimize it and don't deny it. Yeah, don't just say, well, you know, life is worth living, so don't think those thoughts.
Yeah. And you know, we've concentrated really on young adults, but realize that depression and suicide is also a huge issue among older adults. You know, we happen to have more contact with young adults, but for older adults, when things in your life are changing and you're losing some of the abilities that you've always had and your sense of who you are is changing, it's difficult. And it becomes one of those stressors, because how do I cope with all these things that are changing in my life? And so recognize that this isn't just a young person's problem. This is all ages. So maybe the person you need to ask isn't always your grandchild. Maybe it's that neighbor next to you, or maybe it's your best friend.